Welcome to the first What Now teen-led youth town hall series. We're going to be talking about a handful of different social justice topics over these town halls. Today, we're going to be talking about health equity. Next week, we're going to talk about climate justice. And the week after, we'll be talking about education reform. So if you're a teenager and you are passionate about any of these things, these are for you. This is how we start to get you involved in all of the different ways that you can take those things that you're really excited about and passionate about and turn them into like actual political action, which is pretty exciting. My name is Amy Vanderweel. I'm the manager of the South Providence Library. I know if you're from the Met, you've probably come and visit me at my library before. Hi, it's good to see all of you again. We miss seeing you around the library. And you will probably also recognize a handful of the people on these panels as well. We've got a couple Met students, we've got a couple of high schoolers from East Providence Classical as well. So we're so glad you're here. So this series, we're calling it What Now, came about from a grant from the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities. Something that I read this year is that fewer than half of eligible voters age 18 to 29 voted in the 2016 election. So while the 2020 election did see a slight increase in voter turnout from young, like newly eligible voters, the final data still shows that only about 50% voted. So I know a ton of teens that are passionate about social justice, about climate change, about equitable healthcare and education reform. I know that Providence is full of a ton of incredible student groups and young, exciting legislators doing the work to make policy change within the state around these issues. And I hope these panels inspire you to take those things that you're passionate about, turn them into real civic action, whether it's running for office. We're going to talk about how old you have to be to run for office, like some of our panelists, or getting involved in one of the student groups we're talking to over the next couple of weeks, or even just registering you and your friends to vote in the next election. I know my friend Andrea here was telling me that you can pre-register to vote. So we'll talk about a little bit about that as well. This project is supported by the XIX Shall Not Be Denied Why It Matters initiative from the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities, part of the nationwide Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative. And it's administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils, funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. To learn more, you can visit shallnotbedenied.org. So one thing that I'm going to drop into the chat to everybody right now, it's a survey. I promise it won't take you more than 60 seconds to take when this is all over, and I'll remind you again at the end as well. And it's just to let the people who gave us money, let them know that you think we did a fabulous job, okay? Really helps us out. Okay, so let's get going. First, we have our teen moderator, local classical senior high schooler, Deb Adekunle. She's been involved in PVD Young Makers and Youth in Action. Born and bred in Nigeria, Deb has a love-hate relationship with exploring Rhode Island and the American culture in its entirety. Deb is committed to working for better education in all Providence public schools and uses her platform as a 2021 representative of the National After School Alliance to make real change in her community. She's passionate about health equity, especially for multilingual neighbors. Her favorite thing to do is binge watch medical dramas or go hiking. Next, we have Andrea Gonzalez Sanchez, who's the program facilitator at Young Voices Rhode Island. Who knows about Young Voices? Yes. A local organization that addresses the desperate need for authentic youth voice in policymaking throughout Rhode Island. Since our organization was founded, they've helped more than 750 BIPOC youth transform into confident leaders who continue to make a difference across the state. Andrea is a young, determined, and hungry Latinx advocate for justice, equality, and education. She's working towards a master's in social work right now. And last but not least, we are so excited to welcome David Morales, who's the Rhode Island State Representative for Local District 7, which encompasses the Mount Pleasant, Elmhurst, and Valley neighborhoods in Providence. Having been raised by a single immigrant mother in poverty, he's passionate about organizing around economic housing and healthcare justice. Over the last several years, he's been involved in local community efforts alongside the Sunrise Movement and Never Again RI. He's the youngest graduate from Brown University's MPA program and is proud to call the diverse community of Mount Pleasant, Providence his home. So if you have a question, I'm going to be monitoring the chat and we're going to have a little bit of time for questions at the end. It can be everything from, Deb, what medical drama are you binge watching these days? To can somebody send me the link so that I can pre-register to vote? We'll have some time to talk about all of those things, okay? So here we go. Deb, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Hi, everyone. Okay, so I'm very excited about this conversation today. I'm with two people I really admire, Andrea and David, and I hope we have a very fun conversation. So, so I just want to reinforce that this is not like a Q&A session. It's supposed to be like a conversation, a fun one between us, just to educate everyone. And the first question would be, at what age can youth be a part of the civic or democratic action in Rhode Island?
Well, I'll just start by saying if it comes down to action, I would argue that you can be involved at any age. You can attend your protest while you're still in the womb, right? You could still be supporting and standing in solidarity with labor unions who might be striking for better benefits. So when it comes to direct action, whether it's attending a protest, testifying in support of a bill or against a bill, that could start at any age. In terms of being registered to vote, however, you would have to be 18 to vote, and you'd also have to be 18 in order to run for office at the local or state level.
I think that to be able to do something about whatever political climate you're living in, you really just have to be present. That's it. There's no age requirement to be politically involved in your community. So for example, because I'm in Young Voices, one of the things we focus on is empowering youth to go to town hall meetings, go and testify, like David mentioned. And then we also have our own subgroups that work on laws by themselves. For example, we have a group called Girl Power, and they notice the disparities between young women of color and their counterparts. And what they do is then they think about what's going on, and then they propose how to make a change. And the same happens with organizations such as PASS, which is the Providence Alliance for Student Safety, which I am also involved in. And for them, it was the fact that SROs in schools should not be in schools, period. And they literally just drafted and wrote how to make that happen, how to remove them from schools. And they put that up there. Now, how are youth involved? They are the ones who are making this. They have adult allies, but they're the ones writing these. They're the ones deciding we don't want SROs in schools. They're the ones making those changes. So there is no age requirement for you to make change.
Yeah, just to like reinforce what David and Andrea is saying, it's just being present and being passionate about what you want to be passionate about. There are many student organizations in Providence, Rhode Island that you can be a part of if you want to, if you're really passionate about something. So you can join Youth in Action, you can join PVD Makers, you can join PSU or RISE, just a bunch of organizations that can help you in what way you want to be helped. So our next question, if you guys can give us a quick summary into your journey into civic and civil action from like when you were around my age or even younger, how did it all begin?
Well, I just very recently turned 18. So I was a youth not that long ago. And I actually started my journey when I was around, I'm going to say 12 to 13 years old, which is also around when I got into this country. And I got involved with Young Voices because I thought that, it was kind of like a job in which I would just learn and they would pay me. And I thought that was it. And then I started slowly learning about the disparities, not only that I was facing for being an immigrant Latinx woman, but also the unfairities and disparities that my peers were facing for being, LGBTQ plus like I am, et cetera, et cetera. And that drove me to want to do more. And I didn't know that I could until Young Voices was like, you know that you can testify, right? And you know that you can help us write these things, right? Like this is for everyone to do. Like it doesn't matter what age you are. So at a very young age, I already started getting involved with organizations like Planned Parenthood, Youth Pride. I started getting involved with them, learning more, and then putting that information to other places. What I did to personally get involved was literally join these organizations and then educate others about it.
That is a wonderful story, Andrea. Thank you so much for sharing that, because I can only imagine how many youth we have on this call could probably relate to your story and will probably be following the same trajectory. So I would say, in terms of my own story and my own journey towards civic engagement, Formally, it didn't start until like I was age 15 or 16, but I often say that it traces all the way back to my childhood and my own upbringing. As it was mentioned earlier, when I was being introduced, I was raised by a single mom. It was just myself and my older sister. So at a young age, I watched my mom work a lot of jobs, very much odd jobs, whether it was in the fields picking vegetables or fruit, whether it was at a grocery store or at a gas station, a clerk at a mini mart, you name it, she was usually working 2 to 3 jobs. Growing up, however, I didn't think much about it because my neighbors were also working class or on a fixed income. So I just assumed that was normal. It wasn't until I was around the age of 15, 16 that I started getting involved in my high school's speech and debate program. And I remember going to tournaments at other schools that were a lot more affluent in areas I was not necessarily familiar with. And that's when I first started making note of inequalities and the inequities that exist when comparing my public school over to the resources that a different private school had. So that for me, I often cite is the moment I was quote unquote, what we like to call radicalized and really began to put the pieces together. And then I also put the pieces together in terms of why my mom was being forced to work multiple jobs because she was in jobs that paid her the minimum wage, which are far from being a living wage. Hence the stress to pay for groceries, pay the rent, pay utility bills, and other daily expenses. So formally, I was conscious about all these different aspects around 16. And when I started heading off to college at age 17 is when I started getting more involved in a formal manner. And that looked like working on local campaigns, most specifically focused on affordable housing, because that was something that I could deeply relate to, given the fact that, again, I watched my mom struggle and debate whether or not we would have enough money at the end of the month to pay for rent and still pay for other expenses. So for me, it ultimately comes back down to lived experience, and alongside that, the opportunities that grassroots organizations were able to present in terms of being able to fight and organize for these different causes.
Yeah, you guys are really like strong. And I'm like, oh my God, you guys, I admire you guys. So our next question is, how have you guys, how have you folks engaged youth in the past with your work, and what are your future plans on engaging youth with whatever work you do?
Well, being in Young Voices, our whole thing is Young Voices, meaning that the youth are the ones who make a lot of decisions on what we're focusing on next. We just give them kind of like the tools, right? We're just there to give you, okay, here's what you can use. And now with that, you can do whatever you need to do or whatever you want to do. So what we do is we just provide that, and then it is completely up to them to continue and follow through and do what they need to do. We teach them how to properly do it as well. Like, for example, how to write a professional email so that you can send it to a representative, how to write a testimony so that people listen to you, how to speak in public so that you can go in front of those people and tell them why things are needed or why we need to remove them. And they are like, our whole purpose is to make sure that that youth voice is elevated, because when it is not, we are not listening to the people who will be the future of our entire country. Like, without them, there is nothing else. Without our young people, absolutely nothing. So the whole purpose is to elevate them. So we just give them the resources, teach them how to use them, and then we let them be free.
Again, I don't think it can be overstated how much great work Young Voices does. So just thank you again, Andrea, for all that you're doing for our local communities. In terms of some of the projects I worked on to help elevate our youth, I'm a firm believer in paying it forward. I believe it is our responsibility, as especially as fellow young people of color, to be able to share our own lived experience, our own experience being in these different political spaces and circles, and being able to help inform the youth. And I see it as a collaborative process where I'm not just educating you about what I've learned, but most importantly, you're educating me about your own experience. So for me, that looked like during the campaign season when I was running for state representative just a few months ago, but feels like a lifetime ago, I really tried my hardest to try to engage youth into the political process, because for a lot of people, being involved in a campaign is the first time and their first experience being involved in politics. And for me, I always emphasize that politics is always local. It is more important in regards to what the decisions of your mayor and your governor are versus what the president does. Because whatever the president does, you're not necessarily going to feel in your backyard immediately. Whereas the mayor or the governor can make a decision, and before you know it, it just impacted your community. So I tried very intentionally to work alongside Sunrise Rhode Island to try to recruit youth, specifically high school youth, to come and join our campaign and become trained on what it's like to knock on doors and talk with working people, what it's like to be able to understand what their experiences are, but then most importantly, learn about their experiences and then being able to tell them, well, these are the policy solutions that will help address that. If you are concerned about housing not being affordable, these are the plans that we're presenting to try to make housing more affordable, whether that is putting it as a part of the state budget, whether that's about making sure that we reprioritize what the city budget looks like, whether that looks like zoning. And of course, some things are a little more detailed than others, but the idea was that very similar to what Andrea had mentioned, it's about giving the youth the framework. And I believe that our campaign helped do that. And I always looked forward to our Saturday canvases because that's when we had a lot of youth come out and show up on a Saturday morning. And for me, I was always honored that any high school student would take the time out of their own busy and personal lives to come and join the work that we were doing. And now as a legislator, one of the main ways I try to further get youth involved is anytime I can receive an invitation to have discussions like these or be able to join coalition meetings similar to what Andrea had mentioned earlier about PASS and the work they're doing, I want to be a part of that conversation, learn directly about the experience of youth, and then vice versa, be able to provide them with advice on how to get involved themselves. And given that I'm inside the State House, there are certain inside information and details that I know of that I always love to share with our youth in terms of what's most strategic, what's most effective. And for me, I always emphasize the importance of telling your personal story when you're testifying on a bill. That way we could make our representatives and senators recognize that what we are advocating for has implications in our real lives and in our everyday lives, even if they don't necessarily experience it themselves.
I really think for that, like both of you know the importance of like co-generation collaboration, because a lot of people just they don't really overlook that. They don't really consider like youth when they're making decisions. So I'm thankful for that. So we all know that this past year has been very chaotic with the pandemic and just not the best situation to be in. So how have you folks been providing services for underserved community during the chaotic times?
That's a really good question. So COVID definitely made everyone's lives seem to have gotten a little bit harder. And by a little bit, it's an understatement. It's been very hard for a lot of people, and especially for people that lack the resources to, for example, get proper mental health support, proper medical support, proper even food. Like for a lot of youth, the food that they got was the food from school. A lot of the youth, the mental health support that they got was from like the counselor at school. There was a lot that was lost when we went in through this pandemic, and we're still going through. So one of the things that Young Voices focused on is that although we've always been politically involved and very focused on politics, we shifted our focus, not completely, but we wanted to make sure that there was more space for youth to share their needs. So for example, do we need more mental health support? How can we teach you to reach out to more people? How can we tell you the resources that you might be able to use? And how can we train you to deal with them? For example, all of the staff, I personally went through mental health first aid to make sure that I could help the youth. Because although I am still a young person, I am now an adult and I am in a position of responsibility in which I know what it's like to go through that. I was personally involved in a very abusive household as a young person. And during this pandemic, I was still in that household for a long time. And that was super hard because you can get that support when you are in a household like that. And I'm sure a lot of, for example, LGBTQ plus kids can relate to that, to not be in a safe space to be who you are. So what we did is we tried to increase those mental health supports for our students. And then we also tried to increase the support, for example, sending care packages. Oh, you should take a self-care day and let's use this and let's use that. We also kept always in mind our stipend policies, and we provide money for the people who are joining us. And one of the reasons is for financial, literacy, so that they can learn how to handle money. But another big reason is so that they can actually get those things that they need. So that's some of the ways that we try to support them during this difficult time.
Again, I think Andrea said it perfectly in terms of during this pandemic, what we have needed has been direct action and direct service. And I look at COVID relief in two different buckets. The first one that I just stated, the direct service. And for me, I always see myself as a resource for the community, for the neighborhood. And that looks like, again, when I was knocking on doors throughout the pandemic and the peak of it, I really shifted away from not just making it about politics and policy, but most importantly, what are your current needs? And I don't believe in reinventing the wheel when different organizations are already doing this important work. Most specifically, in the organization that I have leaned on the most throughout this entire pandemic has been Amor. They have done an incredible job. And for everyone's context, Amor is a grassroots organization here in Rhode Island that really focuses on assistance. Again, they shifted their focus. They're mostly focused on immigration policy, but have most importantly now really been focusing on direct service and providing resources to underserved communities. So they would often do free grocery deliveries, which I, again, was very honored to be a part of. And I always enjoyed going to the different parts of my neighborhood, but also areas in Pawtucket and Central Falls to deliver groceries to those in need. Because again, these, although they are Band-Aid solutions to a degree, they are so necessary because they literally impact someone's day, that impacts someone's week. Beyond that, it looks like being a resource in terms of being able to distribute information. And since the rollout of the vaccine, one conscious effort that I've been making is anytime eligibility changes for the COVID-19 vaccine, I make sure to inform my newsletter, inform my contacts, anyone's number that I have, I make sure to text it over to them. But what I have found most effective is actually going directly to a lot of our small businesses, especially here in Mount Pleasant, where we're predominantly Latino. I've been going to the small businesses where I know it is a community pillar. It is a community hub. You are going to essentially a gossip with the person at the panaderia. You are going to talk it out with the person that is serving you up your lunch. And so for me, I made the conscious effort of going around with homemade flyers and telling them, hey, if you could pass this information along, here's a phone number where our people can be able to call and get a COVID-19 vaccine. And of course, being conscious of languages, I made sure to have flyers in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, because you need to meet people where they are at. Now, in terms of the second bucket that I was referring to earlier, in terms of COVID relief, I have looked at it now from a more sustainable standpoint. What can we do to have everlasting solutions? Because as it has been stated before, COVID exacerbated the issues that already exist. For example, a lack of healthcare, a lack of well-paying jobs, a lack of housing, a lack of public education infrastructure. So I'm really focused on different policies that would help alleviate a lot of these different issues, some of which have included one of my bills that would provide hazard pay to all essential workers in large businesses, because despite the fact that our grocery store clerks at the Stop and Shop, at the Price and Right, at the Walmart have been risking their health to provide us with the services we need, they're still earning low wages, despite the fact that, again, they're risking their health and those of their families. Yet these big companies don't believe they deserve additional compensation. So through law, I want to make sure that anytime we're in these public emergencies, that any worker who is still on the front lines is being paid an additional amount, that being 1.3 times their base pay. So just to not complicate things, if you make $12 an hour under this bill, you would make $15.60 an hour. Beyond that, one of the current bills that I'm working on that I actually think we might get through, and I'm very excited about it, would be a moratorium on utility shutoffs. We are in a pandemic, people are struggling, utility rates increase each and every single year. We actually had a utility increase rate back in October. A lot of people don't know that, but on average, your electricity bill is about $10 more than it was back in September. So as a result of that, I do not believe anyone's utilities should be shut off because they are unable to pay, whether it is due to loss of employment or reduced hours, or simply the fact that they are ill and are unable to work. So this would put a moratorium on utility shutoffs being gas, electricity, and water up until the declared emergency is lifted. That will likely be when everyone has been fully vaccinated. Again, these are just some of the issues I'm working on to provide that COVID relief in a sustainable way.
Again, I can't thank you guys enough. You guys are doing the hard work for the community and all of us. So how does housing equity look like to you guys during this COVID crisis? And how have you guys been supporting that? Because a lot of people have been displaced because of COVID-19.
I think one of the big things is making sure everyone has healthcare and can visit the doctor, can receive the treatment they need without having to worry about out-of-pocket expenses, deductibles, co-payments, or essentially any financial barrier that will give them a reason not to go. A lot of people do not go to the doctor or seek services because of how expensive it is. You have to make the decision on whether or not you believe it is worth getting yourself into serious debt to relieve and address one of the health issues you might be experiencing. And for me, that looks like making sure that, again, we pass laws that say everyone has healthcare coverage without the worry of out-of-pocket expenses. And that includes dental, vision, and mental health. Because again, all of those are essential to our health in general. And alongside that, making sure our community health centers are well funded. Community health centers are, I believe, the backbone of a lot of our communities. And I would like to see them expanded across urban communities like Providence, Pawtucket, and Central Falls. Because even though our closest community health center here in the Mount Pleasant area is about 3 miles away, which might not seem like a lot, to some people that is actually a large form of a commute. And alongside health equity, I think we also need to talk about other barriers such as transportation. I believe public transportation in our state should be free of cost, and people should be able to get to wherever they need to go. And again, I do think that goes back to the discussion of public health and making sure people have safe spaces on how they can travel without, again, having to worry about the burden of costs. And then lastly, affordable housing. You need a safe space to be able to live. And right now, especially again in our urban areas, there just aren't enough spaces for people to afford, especially families. We literally have a family of 6 here in our neighborhood who lives like in a 2-bedroom apartment because that's all they can simply afford. So now you have, on average, 3 children sharing 1 room. And that in itself is not sustainable. And again, it is disproportionately affecting poor people, working people, and people of color. And I want to emphasize that none of this is a coincidence. All of this are consequences of policy decisions or a lack of policy decisions. So this is why, in my role, I believe it is pivotal, especially during COVID, that we take a step back, we recognize how broken these systems were before the pandemic, and put ourselves in a position where we are actually finally going to invest in our communities and make sure that there is health equity, regardless of your zip code or where you live.
Yeah, I could not have said it better. And I think housing equity, it comes from all of the places, just like the Representative Morales said, like it is all about just all of these little pieces fit in a puzzle, right? In which, oh, I get sick, I'm into so much debt, I can't pay my household now. So how do we support each one of these individual pieces so that the puzzle fits together so that we can actually have that equity? Because sadly, we are not just, it's not just one thing that we are suffering from, right? It's not just, oh, my house is too expensive. It is not just that. It is that our transportation is too expensive. And then I can't get to places because it's not safe for me. And I'm not likely to be able to afford any of these because I'm already in debt for other things. And education is expensive. And all of these things kind of fit together to make the entire living situation a problem and an issue. So when we focus about housing equity, we can't just focus about making houses less expensive for people or making them safer. We have to focus on every single one of the pieces that fits that puzzle so that every single person that does get a house, that does have to move in somewhere new, has an actual safe space. And a safe space does not only contribute a warm bed and a ceiling, it contributes to your health, to your food, the food that you eat, the way that you go from place to place, etc.
And if I may, Deb, very quickly before we just move on to the next question, I do think it's also important, especially for our youth, that we need to invest in our public school buildings. They are a travesty right now. They are literally deteriorating. I've been in certain schools where the roofs are literally falling, or you see mold, or water have traces of lead. And again, all of these things we can easily address. If we just go back, we look at the city or state budget, and we start making a line item saying, we are going to make sure that we repair our school buildings, because it is unconscionable for any of our youth, again, regardless of where they live, to go into a school where water has traces of lead. So again, even as Andrea perfectly said, it's all a puzzle. It's all a big part of the pieces. And especially with our youth, which again, keep in mind, Providence Public Schools are predominantly students of color, specifically 88% students of color. We need to make sure they're in safe buildings. And alongside that, we're not even diving into mental health yet, right? We're just talking about the building infrastructure. We also need to address the personnel inside the building and making sure we have enough counselors. I would argue we need to have one counselor for every 250 students. As of right now, we have one counselor for every 550 students. And none of that to me makes any sense. And if we are serious about health equity, those are the steps that we need to take.
You guys literally put my thoughts in words. The intersectionality of everything is just right there. We just have to go back to the state and the budget, like David said, and fix it from the root. So I'm aware that the current bill, House Bill 5604, I always forget the number, relates to some update in our current sex education curriculum. I know that you guys, either one of you guys or both of you guys are working on it in some way or form. So can you explain how that process is looking like and what that would be in how that will play out in our school after the bill is passed? Hopefully it's passed.
Yeah, so for full context, and just want to make sure we're all on the same page, which I'm sure we are, but House Bill 5604 is in regards to sex education, correct, in our public schools, Deb? Yeah, so we have already had a committee hearing for it in terms of the process. It was heard on March 3rd, and it is currently being held for what we call further study. So it is our responsibility as representatives, myself as a proud co-sponsor of it, alongside Rebecca Kislak, who is a representative from the city of Providence on the east side. It's going to be our responsibility to have a conversation with the chairperson of the education committee and be able to really convince them and discuss why this is so important for our public schools to mandate. And from there on out, we'll have those discussions. Similarly, the senators who are sponsoring on the Senate side will have those same conversations with the chairperson. That chairperson will have a conversation with the House Speaker or the Senate President. And then eventually we'll get it down to the floor for a vote where all representatives and senators get to vote on. So that is the process. And one of the ways that we can speed that process up is by you yourself as youth contacting your legislators and again letting them know this bill will impact me in my everyday life at school and I need you to support it, and tell your colleagues and the people that you work with that this is an important issue that we need to push forward. Because this is what oftentimes happens. We will hold a bill for further study with the idea that if we don't vote the bill down but we just don't do anything with it, the attention is going to go away and then we never have to address it. And I have a feeling that this is exactly what's happening with this bill in specific. So again, my advice to all the youth to push this bill forward. Again, we are talking about House Bill 5604, is to contact your representative, your senator, and let them know this is a very important issue to me and I need you as my representative to push this forward.
Definitely. And I think a very important part about this is to educate yourselves on why it's so important. Like, for example, I used to work at Planned Parenthood as a student teaching about responsible sexuality. So I was the one providing those resources for young people, because in schools we lacked them so much. There was so much misinformation, so much shaming, and there was, whether we would like to admit it or not, there was a political agenda behind all of the things they were teaching us and how incorrect they were. All of these things came from this belief that our society should be heterosexual only, for example, and that everyone should stay abstinent until they're married. And these are beliefs that not everyone holds, because we're not part of the same like background and the same, beliefs and morals. And that was leading to a lot of misinformation about the resources that people could use. There was safer sex supplies, and they were demonized. They were deemed as these like things that are just so ineffective and they're just so wrong. And it just made students feel unsafe. And it probably, I am 100% sure, it led to a lot of people making mistakes and getting hurt due to this miscommunication. There was not a talk about consent, not a talk about healthy relationships, how to properly protect yourself when you are in these situations. There was not a talk about the stigma behind STDs and HIV. There was not even a drop of information about the things that really, really impact us every day. How rape culture has been affecting women, how like all of these things, once again, it's a puzzle, right? And all of these things go together. And when we are lacking that education, we are hurting. They are harming us by not putting these things forward. So what we need to do, first of all, educate yourself on why it's so important to us. How have you been affected by this? Are there things that you believe that aren't true? Because I know I didn't know anything about my body, and all of the things that they told me were lies. I know that as a young woman, I was scared of myself, of my likes. I know that as an LGBTQ plus student, I never learned about the relationships that I could have and how to be safe in them. I never learned this in school, and that was needed. So I was harmed by it because I didn't know any better. So you all are being harmed by this in some way or another. Learn how, and then put that forward. Say, I am being harmed because this is not happening, and this is how you're hurting me, and this is gonna impact my life. The fact that we have so many teenage pregnancies, the fact that so many of us are struggling with our own feelings and emotions, and we don't have that mental health support, it all comes from that place. So just educate yourself on it, and make sure to contact the people who are up there making those decisions for you, which no one should be making those decisions for you.
All right. So I have like one question from our Q&A by Ruby. What is everyone's thought on the House Bill 670 on the curriculum?
It is absolutely terrible. It is a terrible bill, and for everyone's context as to what it is, it would prohibit the teaching of quote unquote divisive concepts, whether that is related to politics, government, race, sex, racism. Again, not very controversial topics, but again, I believe this is a way to prevent our youth from really understanding true history and understanding the true implications, especially in terms of what this country has done and the harm it has posed against people of color, the harm that it has posed against poor people, the harm that it has posed against the LGBTQ community. And I find this as a way for our education system to be silent about it. And again, I'm very disappointed that during the middle of a global pandemic, there are representatives who believe that this is a priority. While we have school buildings that have traces of lead in terms of their water systems, we have school buildings whose roofs are falling. They believe the most important thing to prioritize is whether or not the curriculum is covering certain topics that they don't agree with. So I believe this is a very selfish bill. It will be receiving a hearing tomorrow. I think it would be great for, while the deadline has passed to provide verbal testimony, I think it'd be very powerful if there's a lot of written testimony from students saying how harmful this was. And I see in the chat that Ruby had stated that they testified against it. So thank you so much for doing that, Ruby.
Yeah, I think if any youth wants to testify against it, just like I can tell Amy to put my email in the chat, and you guys can send me an email and I'll give you the link to testify against it. You can write a written testimony because, as David said, the deadline for verbal is passed. But I very much agree it's really important for us to stand against what we believe we don't need in our society and stand for the policies that we need. One quick question before our list is going to be real quick because we're wrapping up. It's for the House Bill 5604 that we talked about earlier. So students that want to add some clause to it or remove some clause or want to be a part of the decision making with that bill, how can they be involved?
That's such a great question, because I will say this first and foremost, bills aren't always perfect and there are always rooms for improvement, especially, again, those with lived experience and individuals who are going to be impacted by the implications of a bill. So if you have suggestions on how we can improve the bill I was just stated, I would recommend emailing and reaching out to the sponsor of it. Again, that is Representative Rebecca Kislak from the east side of Providence. If you look her up on the General Assembly website, the state government website, you'll be able to find her email. So I would recommend writing to her and noting what your recommendations are. That way she can go back, have a conversation with the chairman, and we will add what we call a substitute amendment. And that way we are able to make revisions to the bill that was originally drafted.
All right, thank you everyone for this conversation. I had fun. I don't know about all you guys. I had a lot of fun, and I hope to see you all next Tuesday with the next panel, and I'll pass it on to Amy.
Thank you all for being here. I know you can hear me in a couple of different places here. We're so excited. I feel like we barely scratched the surface of how big this topic is, and especially how it's affecting Providence residents and Rhode Island residents specifically. But I'm so glad to hear about all of the different ways that teens can start to get involved and can get more engaged in advancing health equity in Providence and in Rhode Island in general. So like I mentioned before, we have just like a small survey. I just dropped it in the chat, and it will probably show up for you too after the webinar ends. I promise it won't take more than 60 seconds. Okay, it's like yes and no questions. You don't have to write any essays or anything, but it does really help us out if you take it real quick. Next week on Tuesday, April 6th at 1:30, we're going to have Brandon Feliz, who's a Met student, talking to Rhode Island State Senator Sam Bell and a representative from the Providence chapter of the Sunrise Movement, Arden Reynolds. They're going to be talking about climate justice. And that actually, I'm going to drop a link to that as well if you want to join next week. And then our last panel will be on April 13th. It'll be Deb, who's over there, Brandon, and Dakota Watjen of East Providence High School, along with Rhode Island State Senator Tiara Mack about education reform. So if you have more questions about the curriculum bill that we were just talking about, this is a great place to come and talk about that and all of the different ways that you can get involved in curriculum and education reform in your schools. And I'm gonna drop, again, one more link. Here we go, into the chat, there we go. If you have a teacher who you really want to attend one of these panels, send them this link, send them my email. I'm happy to get them signed up. And that's it. Thank you all for coming. Thanks, Andrea, David, and Deb for doing this. I feel like I learned so much today about how to actually like get involved in my community. So I'm really excited to start taking action there. Okay. If you have any questions, if you want a recording of this, I'm going to put a recording of this up on the website afterwards, on our PCL website, provcomlib.org, and probably our Facebook page as well. So everyone have a great Tuesday and hopefully see you next week.